apply then to your professional life. And you're like, oh, yes. Some of my users, they are behaving like children.
For example.
But some of them don't. Like some of them behave like, great teachers and great, coaches and other great adults in your life that you interact with along the way with your children, right? Some of the things I talk about in that talk is like your adaptability. And one thing that I learned as a parent, my dog is ringing in his bells. He wants to go outside. He's going to have to wait. But one of the things that you learn as a parent is that you have to be able to adapt to the changing needs of the child, right? And I used to think, well, a lot of people used to think that I was like very much type A. Like type A had to do things a certain way no matter what. Well, let me just tell you, like having kids changes that very quickly.
Oh, it sure does.
Whatever your plan A is, you can throw it right out the window because they are going to go with plan B, C, D, E, F, G. They are going to go wildly off your track and you just have to roll with it. And so being adaptable to like the different changes and needs of a project also apply, right? You can't just go into a project thinking, okay, here's the plan. We're going to go with it. There are things that come up, things that happen, whether it's resources or scope changes or whatever it is, you have to be adaptable. And then with project management, like what's the next priority? What is the most important thing? And who's going to be able to make that decision? Like, and making sure that communication is very clear and very aligned with everyone that's working on the project. And so that we can all work together in the same vein, I think that's really the thing. And then as a parent, I get to be the leader. So I get to make the decisions.
You're the boss.
I mean, I'm one of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Which I think is one of those things that I've learned as a parent is it's also easy to get lost as a parent and your children to become the bosses of you. And I think that also is tangentially related to managing any software or technology or CRM. Like of course we need to listen to the business and the business needs, but we can't let our users boss us around. We know what the scalability of the platform is going to be. We know where there's room for growth, where there's improvement, what can be modified or tweaked. And we need to put our foot down.
It reminds me of like as a parent, your kids might be telling you, well, my friend can do it. My friend has this thing, or my friend's parents let them do that. And I'm like, well, yes, but you're special. We're going to do it this way. And you're absolutely right though. It's like, and you look at like users that have come in from like a different org that come in and are asking for things. Like, well, I did this at my last org. And this happened to me when I was a solo admin. Right. And I was like, that's great. It sounds like you had developer support. That sounds like something for code. And that's really amazing. And if you think that we can, hire someone to do that, we're going to have to go up to the next stakeholder level because it's going to cost us.
Yeah.
It would cost someone to come in and like have a chef cook meals at the house. Like, no, I'm sorry. Just have to take what I can do for you. I don't have a chef to support what I'm doing here. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Most people think when they think of data backup, they think of their core customer or whatever that data is that they're storing in Salesforce. But everything that makes your Salesforce is also data in some form or structure, but kind of known as metadata. If we're talking kind of your customer data, the typical structure for that, it will start with a kind of high level parent type object. Take account, for example, and you're going to have a bunch of different records that are going to branch off of that will be related to it in some form or another through one of the relationships you can choose. It's similar. If you ever looked at a database, it's similar, but it's not similar at the same time. So if you don't know those relationships, you don't know how they sign back up and what you need to know before you put that data in, it can become a really messy job and it's time consuming. If you've got nothing structuring that for you on the way back in and you're doing it all by hand, it's messy. It's the bigger the org, the harder that's going to become. And yeah, it very quickly gets to that point, no matter how young your Salesforce org is or how new you're going to be to it. And then if you look at metadata, that's a really similar story. The more you customize, the more metadata you're gonna have. But if something happens to your actual Salesforce org, what would you do if you don't have a copy of what you've done to it? And you've got to think of that as that's your package of Salesforce. That's your customizations and the things that make your Salesforce yours. And if you've not took that and stored it somewhere in a repository or in a backup solution, and something happens and that goes somewhere and you get given a fresh new org to start again with, you've got nothing left. You're going to have to start from the beginning, and nobody's going to remember everything that was in there, what it was doing, and that's then going to in turn make it even harder for your data to go back in when you want to put your data back in, because you've got none of that customizations and all the fields that you've got on your data stored back to those customizations. So if you break a link, even the smallest, you're going to run into big problems.
Absolutely. You mentioned spending a lot of time in CSVs that you don't want to be doing if you lose your data. Why is that typically that we spend our time in CSVs? And what can we do to avoid spending time in CSVs or wrestling with Salesforce's data loader?
That's your raw form of data basically, and that's where you're going to want to build up the structure of how you want to go in. And if you're using those traditional tools like data loader that you mentioned, CSVs is what you're going to upload to there. So in whatever form you receive that data, one way or another, you're going to have to transform it or order it or do something to it within that CSV file before you then pop that through data loader back into Salesforce. And then even when you get to data loader, you've got to pick your order of fields and what ones you're storing, what ones you're ignoring. If they're not named right, they'll not map properly. And that's all got, someone has to know all of that to do all of that. And that's usually where the tricky part comes, because Salesforce orgs develop over time. They're not one person's done everything and knows everything. So it becomes a bit of a tricky, risky business that if you've not kept track of that, how would you know what you're putting back in really? So that's where, for me, the importance of a tool really comes in to help that.
We all use a ton of technology instinctively. We almost don't acknowledge the progress that we make every couple of years in the way that we're using things. You and I sitting here using some technology to have this conversation that even 5 or 6 years ago would not be creating what happened here. And I think we can extend that into our working life, where we have to think really consciously of, do I want to build this? Do I want to invest a finite set of resources that I have into solving a problem that a technology business spends all day, every week, every month, and every year trying to invest? Or can I look at choosing the right partner that supplements the decisions I want to take, the knowledge I have internally, to accelerate some of the focus areas that I'm talking about? And yes, of course, in some areas here, I'm talking about gear set ourselves, but really this can extend to any technology that you're looking for. And if you think of it in this scenario, there's very few people who are thinking of trying to build digital ways to communicate across an organization from scratch. People are looking and going, well, look, there's some trusted partners that we can have there. There's some great technology that enables us to do that at scale, that is taking care of security, that is taking care of accessibility, that is taking care of making sure that we're able to do it in a fun way that helps us to feel connected. And that's something that most people are really, really comfortable with. And I would urge people to think about partnering with any organization or individual outside of their own business as a way to accelerate the decisions that they want to take.
Yeah, I think throughout this conversation we've talked about the overarching kind of theme is all of this provides like an underlying like system of support, whether that be the education. We spoke about education and that supporting what we need. We talked on technology, different technology stacks that we're using as a system of support, and the partner network as a system of support, and all of those interplaying with each other in a nice, if you get it right, in a nice harmonious way. One of the things we obviously advocate for as a DevOps company is, and you've said it already, is iteration and refining what we are doing based on the information provided to us. But what else can we do, or when we're thinking about doing that, when we're looking at our support systems that support us, how do we how do we make the most of that and make sure that we have the underlying infrastructure to support those kind of changes and partnering well in education and expectation setting?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and a deep one, really. I think it's about consciously like building systems that support you, and I want to kind of define what I mean by systems. I'm not just talking about technology here. I'm not just talking about formal processes. I'm talking that both on an individual and an organizational level, you want to make sure that you have got systems in place that support the work that you need to do. So on a personal level, talking for myself, like I know there is a family system that I need to be really healthy, that supports me in being able to go out and do my best work. I know that there's a friendship system that is really important. And whilst it sounds really formal and let's be clear, I don't talk to my daughter about a family system. We have fun and we play, right? But I think of it in these terms. And there's systems that are in place that I need to show up and bring my best self to work as much as possible. And I don't always get that right. And so I'm reflecting on the juggle of having two working parents and a young daughter. And so we have to work out how that all knits together. There's systems that you can build at work. There's relationships and colleagues that you need to build with your peers that are foundational. Like I have some really strong relationships that I use to reflect and review the work that I'm doing, not as a way to check that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, but with a group of people that I really trust to rubber duck some of the ideas that I've got to build that system to support. And I then think of putting in place processes for teams. Think of the systems that you've got. Now, that might be weekly code reviews. That might be a monthly retro on what went well and what didn't. Those organizational processes that you set up as systems to underpin the work that you're doing are really important. And like all of this in my mind comes before you're thinking of the technology that you're going to use. Like most of the happiness and the accountability and the value that we can feel in an organization is supplemented by that technology. But you have to underpin the processes that go with that. And then from a systems perspective, it's about being super clear on what can be achieved in the time that you've got. It will be a surprise to nobody that pretty much in every organization, there is a desire to move faster than is probably humanly possible. And so we all recognize that when we're talking to each other. And yet sometimes in the middle of the week, we can forget that we need to say sometimes we're not able to deliver that right now. We're not able to do that in this timescale, but we can do it in this timescale. And I think articulating what that looks like. And then when you have systems, yes, I am talking about having really clear pipelines of work that you're going to be delivering, having really clear QA, having really clear UAT processes and systems in place to make sure that you're successful in what you're doing, but also going into the other end of the process. So many folks here will be admins or devs who will get business requirements fired towards them. Now, you would hope that they're always done in a timely manner with lots and lots of context and lots and lots of detail behind them. But we also know the reality that doesn't always take place. And so it's about trying to help build those systems to make sure that the requests for work and the guidance that can be given to an organization as to why proposing a business change in a certain way makes the outcome more likely to be successful is super important. But I think ultimately,
so it again, just entire days were wasted. I probably have spent an entire year wasted on change sets over the course of my career. That might be exaggerated, but it feels like
I'm
it.
not sure that it is.
Yeah. but regardless, and then when I started to, within the last probably decade or so, started to work with companies that were larger and had better change management and better DevOps processes, I started to kind of pick up on what worked really well, and how to then take that process and work backwards from that, to where you have to, if this is the bar that you need to meet, then you need to do these things to get there. So it was a lot of capturing everything I was working on, whether it was a field or a validation rule or like custom metadata or whatever. I would capture it, and I'd have these huge spreadsheets of like the label name, the API name, whether it was going to be manually updated. Like I would just do that manually, and that would make things go smoother. But obviously, the development time increased there too, because I'd have to capture all of that. So then coming into using gear set, here in the recent years, I was finding like I was relatively new to it, so I had to learn it too. But then I realized like it's figuring all this out for me. Like it notes everything that I've changed and everything that's new, and so all I have to do is just go click and send it. Like that's it. So I was over the moon. I was like, why haven't I been using this sooner? So and again, it just kind of came back to the fact that it was like, well, my client doesn't, and so we can't. But it was definitely a big selling point for me when I was so I was hired as a solution architect. So I was consulting, um, and I was hired as a solution architect at Amazon Air to stand up a Salesforce instance for them. And that was one of the first things we did. I think we did one or two deployments and change sets, and we're like, nope, this is gear set. So by month 3, we were already getting licenses and using gear set, and it was just we improved, I think, our time. So instead of an entire day dedicated to development, or sorry, deployment, we narrowed it down to I think an hour, like of those size. It was insane, and we were like, what do we do with all this time? So then we started to think about how we would actually improve the process, and again, kind of working backwards from what we know we have to get to deploy, kind of keeping track and making sure that we're tracking all of those components that we're deploying.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you mentioned a couple of times there, just right at the end that you were speaking, figuring out the process, like what works, and you mentioned it as you started talking about your experience. Then, is there anything that you've identified that does repeatedly work? You said you figure out what works and what doesn't work. Is there anything that's kind of been universal across the projects that you've worked on in terms of this works really well, we can repeat this and this will scale across other projects or with other clients that I've worked with? Or is it truly no one size fits all to some of this?
Yeah, I would say specifically in gear set, the filters, the ability for us to know that we only check certain pieces of metadata, to be able to filter that down and lessen the time to do the review between the target and the source sandboxes. That's been huge, because there is a lot of, we use Salesforce here at Air very uniquely. It's pretty much all custom. We do use accounts, context, some of the standard objects, but we have very, very specific functionality, and so to narrow even the small minute amount of time that we spend in DevOps, those things add up over time. So all of the little convenience things that kind of make it to where if we're working with, because we have consultants as well that we work with, like if we sit down with them and say, hey, you have these projects, I see that you have these custom metadata, they're in this package, do the filter, and it's done in 5 minutes. So otherwise, just using everything, it's just kind of knowing your org, knowing what you're working on, and being able to understand where the targets are, I suppose.
Yeah.
Help support it.
Yeah. You mentioned as well you had to take your team on this learning journey as well, and the kind of a personal development journey to kind of get to this stage that you're at now. Something that comes a little bit easier to you based on that lens that you've told us about, that always be learning lens and that curiosity. Yeah. What's the kind of key to getting the buy-in from your team to invest in a journey like this, where they're used to doing things a certain way. Let's take change sets, for example,
Right.
as you mentioned. We've always done it this way. We know how to do it this way. It's not the best, but we're going to get
Yeah.
it. We know how to do it. Well, how do you get the buy-in from the team to go down that learning path with you and put the time and the effort into learning new processes?
Yeah. I would say it's actually two gear sets praise as well. The change sets were an easy one. We all jumped in feet first as soon as we went from change sets to doing compare and deploy and seeing that work. Nobody looked back. Everybody was on board. It was so much easier. It was just more convenient for us. It was a better interface. All of the accolades I could give it. That one was definitely no, like hand holding or pulling anyone along. And I think we had the benefit there too of having kind of a mixed experience team. So, we had a handful of people on the team that had multiple years as either a developer or as a Salesforce admin. And then we had a few people that were new. So very fortunately for them, they didn't even really have to deal with the old way. When we brought them on, we're like, here's how we do it with gear set. And it was a lot easier. And so sometimes there was the explaining of like, well, this is how we used to do it. And I was like, oh, I don't want to do that. So that really helped. But for us, like for the question you're asking, really the buy-in has been the switch from the manual deployments to the DevOps practice. And that has been where, like, for myself, it took a little bit to kind of clear that fog of war, as I was calling it, like lift that cloud so I could see the connections between like, here's traditional DevOps and here is how Salesforce does it. And here's where we need to mix the two. Once I got that, it really clicked in my head, but I realized, I have to make sure that I can explain this where everyone can understand it easily. And it is different when you deal, like we do have very good separation of admin duties and developer duties here at our workplace. And so teaching the devs is a little bit easier because they're used to those practices with other development. Unless they've only ever done Salesforce experience, then it's pretty much the same as bringing up an admin. And that was really where we had to like bring people along the journey of like, hey, we've always been doing it with compare and deploy, but what we're going to shift to is this DevOps practice. And that's where you have to answer the tough questions of like, well, this feels slower or this feels more cumbersome, or I'm going to have to do 5 steps instead of 1 or 2. Like, what's this really giving us? And that's where you have to be able to explain those pros and cons of like, in the DevOps pipeline, it does take a few more steps and there's a few more things to work through, but we commit everything to our repository and we're shifting to repository as our source of truth. So we get all of those tried and true practices of, code commits and your repo is your backup, and you can do rollbacks and version control. And then you can also get merge conflicts, which Salesforce really doesn't facilitate, because if you push a change to an org and then I push the one later, I win. You can blow work and not realize it. Whereas in a repo, it is smart enough to say, wait, there's a difference in these few lines. What do you really want to do here? So it is that like you do have to kind of slow down, step back, take a breath with everyone and just say like, yep, I get that it feels like we can run faster if we're just doing our compare and deploy. But at the same time, we don't get a lot of these safety features and a lot of these good practices. Let's look at it from a different lens and kind of help them embrace that. Like, let me learn about what I'm doing and learn if there is a better way.
Where do people get started first and foremost when they think about looking at these metrics? You published a really great article. I think it was late towards the end of last year, where these are the metrics, but these are the pitfalls that you need to avoid when looking at them. And you had 7. I won't ask you for all 7 right now, but there's one that I think is particularly poignant, which is Goodhart's Law, and there's a couple of others as well. But I'll interviewee's choice about what those the key pitfalls to avoid are. But how do you get started, and how do you not fall into those traps that you mentioned?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And the article that you mentioned, I published it on Dora.dev, which is the website you can go to for all things Dora.
Links in the description, everyone. Don't worry.
Yeah, links in the description. Go click that. But yeah, it's one of our guides there. It is about those 4 key metrics, Dora's software delivery metrics. And of course, there are a bunch of pitfalls. Look, the way to get started, I think, is important. The first thing to think about is that when we ask these questions, when we're trying to assess that software delivery performance, we're doing it at the level of an application or the level of a service. So for example, You might want to think about your own Salesforce implementation. That's one application or service. You wouldn't want to compare that. Let's say you're a bank and you have a mainframe running in the bank that handles all of the transactional data. You probably don't want to compare those 4 metrics for Salesforce versus the 4 metrics for that mainframe. These are
comparison is the thief of joy.
Yeah, exactly. And they both live in separate contexts, right? There's a lot of things that matter to each of those. So I think the first thing to recognize is you have to measure these at a team level. And then the other thing that I'll just offer as a resource is, again, back on Dora.dev, if you go to the quick check, we have, well, as the name says, a quick check that will help you quickly assess what are your team's software delivery metrics. And the truth is, you can wire up a bunch of systems and pull all of this data out of systems, or you can go ask people on your team, how frequently are you deploying to production? And the truth is that you're likely, at the beginning, you're likely to get good enough answers just by talking to people and by taking the quick check, which is a survey that will ask you through those 4 questions, just to get an understanding, a sense for where you are. Now, you mentioned Goodhart's Law, and look, I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And for those of you that don't know, Goodhart's Law is basically when a metric becomes the goal, it ceases to be a good metric, right? So your goal is not to get to 5 deploys a day, 100 deploys a day. That's not the goal. The goal is to improve. At Dora, we have a little tagline that is get better at getting better. This is all about a journey of continuous improvement. And actually, the way that you get better at your deployment frequency, or any of these metrics, I'll pick on deployment frequency for a second. One way you could get better is to show up every day and just mash the deployment button. Deploy, 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 deploy. That's not actually changing anything. It's not actually helping you. So this is where, in my opinion, the research gets even more interesting. We look at the capabilities that drive those metrics. And I think all too often people stop at the metrics and forget that the way to improve is by changing the work that we do. And when I talk about capabilities, I'm really talking about capabilities kind of in broad swaths, kind of 3 different areas. Technical capabilities, things like, I don't know, are you putting your configuration changes into version control so that you have a history of those changes that's auditable, so that it's easy to roll back, etc. Process changes. What sort of change approval process do you have in place? Do all of your changes have to go off to some change approval board who doesn't really understand the system, but there's like some change approval theater that happens in the name of reducing risk? And then probably most importantly is the culture of your organization. And when it comes to culture, do you have a learning culture, a climate for learning within your organization? When something does go wrong, what happens? Oh, something went wrong. Who should we fire? That is a bad response to failure.
Blame game is not good.
Yeah, it's not good. So we need to learn from that. So the way to get started, to come back to your question, the way to get started is to have a conversation. Maybe start with a Dora quick check and understand, how are we doing today? This gives us a baseline. Now look at the capabilities. Again, on Dora.dev, we have a capabilities map that will list out a bunch of the different capabilities. Figure out which one of these is our bottleneck, which one is holding you back. And then go make a change there, and then come back and retest against your baseline. Did it improve? If so, great. Maybe we have a new bottleneck now, or a new constraint. Let's go work there.
Your role care about the most? What does the CRM development manager care about the most?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I think accountability, communication, and respect. All those are really top items that I care about as a manager. Making sure that there's respect across the teams, that we respect different perspectives, different approaches, different ideas. There's, so many different ways you can approach solutions and creative solutions for business problems. And so keeping an open door and open mind around different ways that we can solve problems, I think, is really important. I think it's a really critical way to foster collaboration across the team as well. Communication, of course, we want to be, and I said accountability, and they kind of go hand in hand. We really want to be accountable for meeting our timelines, being present at, meetings, and being able to meet the project needs and the demands of the business. And so holding ourselves accountable, but communicating when we think that something might not go as planned, and making sure we're surfacing any risks as soon as we possibly can. And a little bit that goes back to the previous comments around like showing the magic, right? Like making sure we're communicating if there are complexities, like why and how we can help educate our end users around those complexities. I think really helps our team be accountable for what we own as developers, and then also own what we deliver to the end users and how they
it's all
use
very
it.
circular, isn't it? You know, communication and accountability will build
It
respect.
is, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything
Yep.
that you feel that you and the team have done at Cision quite well to build that? Is there any like kind of examples that you think, yes, we did that really well and that's benefited us down the line?
Yeah, we have a lot of examples. Our team has done just an outstanding job of partnering with our product team and our business end users, really showcasing different features and like approaches to solving complex problems. One of them specifically was we transitioned to lead-based selling earlier in 2023. And so that was a really big change for not just like a sales operational process, but also from a system. And there was a lot of different approaches being thrown around that the business and the other end users thought would be like very tailored and complex. And there was a lot of conversations around where we could come into play around how to simplify the process to scale it using out-of-box functionality, and then how to customize certain pieces rather than the whole thing. And so it was just a really great collaborative conversation between business, between technology, understanding how Salesforce works and how to choose the right approach. And it was a really great, I think, project that went really well.
And the evangelist role, I think, takes a different approach where we focus not specifically on our company and our product so much, but on, as you were just talking about, the problems that organizations have and the various ways that they can be solved. And oh, by the way, the company I work for has a product that does just that. I mean, so it's a softer version of sales. To my knowledge, those of us that have been in these evangelist roles are not paid a salary plus a commission. We're just a salaried individual, and it's our job just to get the message around what the company's about out there in the ecosystem through whatever means that is possible. And I know a lot of people talk about this and have said it for years. I think a lot of businesses and a lot of transactions, regardless of price, tend to go towards people who the organizations know and trust. So if you become that trusted advisor by sharing knowledge, whether it's about your product or other things within Salesforce, you're still building that knowledge base and that trust out there for other people. You're going to be the go-to person or organization that someone's going to prefer when it comes time to buy something that fixes a specific problem.
Their native genius. I like to find the native genius in people, and I want to make sure that they're aware of what that thing is, because I think a lot of times, like what is native genius first? Native genius.
I was going to say
yeah, like what is native genius? Native genius is something that I learned from Liz Wiseman, author of the Multipliers and Impact Players, and she talks about this idea of native genius, which is the innate ability that you have that you don't even really realize is a strength, but it's something that sets you apart. So when somebody asks in an interview, what's your strength and weaknesses, it's usually things that might not even be your innate genius. It's the things that you do, and then other people are like, wow, you do that thing really well. And, for you, it's like, really? That's not that big of a deal. It just comes naturally to me, right? So like for me, my native genius is curiosity and asking questions in such a way that it keeps the conversation moving. And eventually we kind of get to a deeper level of truth at the end of it, right? Somebody else's native genius might be just problem solving and loving putting puzzles together and just cracking in and getting really deep into the details. But as a leader, I think you're in a very fortunate position, and it's a privilege to be able to look across your team and find what that thing is and make sure that they're aware so that they can lean into it and use that to their advantage to grow themselves professionally.
Well, that suits you. I can say that suits you quite nicely if your native genius is curiosity in a position of leadership where you enjoy pulling that out of other people. That curiosity is integral to being able to do that for other people.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
the other thing that really inspires me to be in the leadership space is to create an environment that everybody feels psychologically safe. And if once you have that, once your team feels comfortable to be themselves and bring their authentic selves to work, and then everything else is so much easier, right? Because when you have people coming to the work being themselves, everything else works itself out. They're happier. You get more innovative ideas because they're not like holding things back. So yeah, that's the other part of it. And I don't know if you know who Rick Rubin is.
I do.
You know who he is? Yeah. So Rick Rubin, for the listeners that don't know, he's like a producer that's produced everybody from Jay-Z to Metallica to System of a Down. And I've recently read his book, maybe like a year ago, called The Creative Act. And his native genius is to create the environment for which magic can happen. And I feel like I'd like to be like, my North Star is to be the Rick Rubin of software development.
What is your tips for folks to generate buy-in from either executives or a wider team that changing process is the right thing to do?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, even in your question there, you've kind of hit a very important nail on the head there, is that, getting buy-in comes from two directions, top down and bottom up. So from the bottom up, it's the grassroots admins and developers, the people that are fighting with these deployments day in, day out. They want an easier life. They want to not have to have that fight. And so you get a degree of buy-in there in terms of, we just want things to get better. Equally, you do have to sometimes kind of tackle but it works, and it's the way we've always done it, and we know it works, so why change? So there's a little bit of, delivery of, how's the best way to phrase this one? I think, just kind of highlighting what the benefits, what do you stand to gain from doing this? And obviously the time savings are important to the people at the bottom level. The cost savings and the productivity gains are important to the people at the top level. And I think, you always have to craft your message for the audience. Okay. So, the higher up the management chain you go, potentially the less time that people have available for bigger discussions. So you have to be clear, concise, and straight to the point on that type of messaging. Whereas with
such good advice.
With development teams, you have a little more capacity to, maybe like do a workshop one afternoon or something like that. So always kind of make sure that you know the value of people's time, but also because it's DevOps and because it's an efficient, streamlined way of working, the value of time becomes the message as well, right? Because you're saving time, you're saving efficiency, you're doing less rework, which means that you can focus on new items and new enhancements. You can deliver that change. So yeah, I think it's, at both levels, it's around making sure that you enumerate the benefits. At the top level, sometimes it's about enumerating the risks of not doing it, so you get a balanced viewpoint on that. And it's just making sure that you've covered your basis. The many times in my early career where I've tried to present a scenario to a VP or a CIO or something, and they'll say, "Oh yes, but what about this?" And it's like, I hadn't thought of that. So, do learn to sort of preempt things a lot. VPs and CIOs got there because they think of these bigger problems, and that is very much, aligns to what architects should be thinking.
And I think the answer to that question. I think it's a loaded question, but I think that human interaction is what's so important, right? Humans shouldn't have to worry about running a report, putting it all together, doing it when they could spend the time to get to know the volunteers individually, to be able to help them better work through things. what would you be really happy doing as a volunteer, right? Instead of trying to make sure that they're placed, in this hole or whatever. Those sorts of things that the one thing that AI is never going to be able to replace, as far as not yet, probably not in my lifetime, is a hug. You know, I mean, you're a great hugger. Ben Balapew is a great hugger. They're just people that they care, and sometimes that I don't always know what to say to people, but to reach out and just touch them, right? I sat next to someone at Amanda Beard Nielsen's memorial service, and she was obviously upset and in tears, and I really didn't know what to say, but I just put my arm around her. Those are the kinds of things that AI can't do, computers can't do, automation can't do, but that we as people need to have the time to do, right? And so not be tied to our desk nonstop all day long, every day. And I've done that. I've done that even working in nonprofits. If I can just get this one more thing done. So that's exactly the kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that empathy and human connection is highly important, and I think we often forget that we embody a physical space as humans. We get lost in digital spaces, and I was actually having this conversation with one of my colleagues about AI chatbots, and that the chatbots are able to display degrees of empathy, and which I find the responses that he was saying that it was studied, and these chatbots were giving responses that were empathy driven, and that were in keeping with what a human could potentially say, or maybe should potentially say. But I think what's so dangerous about that is that let's use your text messaging to phone call conversation example from earlier. Somebody's having a bad time.
Mm-hmm.
A phone call or a video call with that person is going to be 1,000 times more effective and empathetic than engaging with them over a text message. Just because it's human on the other side of the text message rather than an AI chatbot or what have you, it doesn't mean anything, because the method of delivery is the same. And then we as humans embody physical spaces, and think how much better you feel after having a conversation with somebody in person, and a cry and a hug, like you mentioned, or in those empathetic scenarios. And I think that's one of those things where we talk about business and decisions being made. If we have all this data, but we can bring all the people that we need in the room to have an actual human discussion and conversation about that data, and they haven't had to sit there, like this world of remote work. And like I advocate for remote work. I only remote work for the majority of the time, even though my office is 15 miles away. I still go into the office once every couple of weeks or so, just for that human connection and to keep those things running. And that's why I love going to Salesforce community events, to continue to build on those connections that can be made so much quicker and so much easier. And the empathy and that humanness is there. I think that we forget a lot of the time, because we do sit behind a computer all day building the flow, or writing Apex code, lightning web components, tinkering with Copilot Studio, whatever it might be. We forget that we embody a physical space more than we embody a digital space. And I think you're right.
I really, and I'll put this question out to anybody who's listening. If you come up with one, I'd love to hear a better analogy. But the one that I keep coming up with is the saying, "How do you eat an elephant? Piece by piece,
piece by a time,
or one piece at a time, or whatever." Like I'm sure there's a better analogy, and I would love, like I said, to have a better analogy. But I really think that that's it. I think I was really involved with the SFDX team when Salesforce DX was coming out, and in dev preview and during development. And I was really excited to be at the first Dreamforce when it came out. And I hung out a lot around the SFDX booth in the dev zone. And I was interested to hear what questions people were coming up with. And the biggest question that everybody came up with was, how do I get my sandbox into a Scratch org? Like, that was what everybody wanted. They wanted a Scratch org to behave like a sandbox. I think that's an example of everybody tried to swallow the elephant whole. I want my entire org totally in version control, totally. I think the better approach is, it's a process to get there. And you treat that process iteratively. If you can carve off 5% of your org's configuration, that's like a really important 5% that you want to be able to test and run a better process and have, quicker releases around and stuff like that. You can carve that off into a modular process. Now you have an org that's 95% still in your old process and 5% in the new process, and in a modularized process that's, more efficient. And you can then, as an organization, experience, is that actually better? Is that benefiting you? Or are you getting better, quality, better kind of feedback, better deliverability and customer satisfaction for your internal users out of what you're building there? And if you are, and that process is working, cool. Then you know what it takes to roll out that process. The one thing I can say is it is absolutely easier to roll out the second one than the first one. Because the first one's just learning. You're having to learn to think about an org in a different way.
Yeah,
I think Scratch orgs sort of force you to do that. One of the other things I find with Scratch orgs a lot, I love Scratch orgs. I think they're...
Me too.
Yeah.
I think that's a debate sometimes still. I actually mentioned that in Texas Dreaming. I did a whole... I was doing a talk on Git, and I said I love Scratch orgs. That's a conversation for another time, though. If we go down that rabbit hole, then we're not going to get anywhere.
I think a lot of people do that. I mean, we were... at one point, our team at .org was like spinning up something like 5 to 10% of Scratch orgs on the platform in our build process, but also there were like thousands of orgs that were spun up by our internal users, by our product team. Our doc writers would check out a feature branch and spin up a Scratch org and use that Scratch org. The reason most people don't like Scratch orgs is because they go away. And
and I'm going to bring it up because when you said it, I was just like, oh my God, yes. You said language is the API of the brain.
Yes,
is a phrase that you taught
words
me.
are APIs for our brains. Working in technology for so long, I was like, oh, this API concept is really cool because I can tell this system to put this data over here via API, right? And I was like, that is the same thing with words. And I've noticed, like, I've been an end user trainer. I've done a lot of trainings. And so I can read when people aren't kind of following me. And I realize, especially for myself, when I'm in a presentation and I hear a word I don't understand, I stop right there and I miss everything that comes after because I'm like, what does that word mean? And how DX for Admins came about was I walked into a project and I was Salesforce admin, and it was a multi-developer team project, not just Salesforce development, but traditional or other development. And I was like, okay, cool. Like, what's the release management process? How are we moving our changes? Where do I send my change sets? Basically, they're like, we don't use change sets. And I was like, what do I do? Does not compute. I don't understand what you mean. How do you just like make changes in every org? That seems like not a good process. They're like, no, we use Salesforce DX. And I was like, what was that? And so they were like, oh, like it's this thing. And then, started talking all these words I did not understand. Packaging, source control, like just none of these words have entered into my world ever before. And so we call it like dev speak. And I'm like, so you're telling me I have to type codes into this thing and it does a bunch of stuff and then things just appear in places. And I don't understand what any of this means. And this was back in 2018. And so DX was so new that every time I Googled, I got more confused because I'd have to Google the words that were used to describe the thing I originally Googled. So I had to do a lot of double and triple Googling. And I was just like, there was a lot of crying in the bathroom, I'm not going to lie, because it was just so frustrating because I was like, can someone just explain to me what this thing is in words that my admin brain can understand? And I vowed one day I was in the bathroom crying. I was like, if I can ever freaking figure this out, I'm going to teach anyone and everyone who's interested in learning, like how to understand this thing, because I know I'm not dumb. I can figure this out. I just need language that I'm familiar with. And so that's how DX for Admins was born. And what it really is a vocabulary lesson. This is what an XML file is. It's just a bunch of folders. It's not like this big scary thing, right? And it's, and then taking the language and then putting it into terms that admins understand. Here's what a profile looks like on the back end. One big click I had with Salesforce DX was, in the admin world, we preach clicks, not code. But with Salesforce DX, the clicks are code, and now I can see it. And our example is like, that your gas pedal makes the car go, but you really don't know how it makes the car go. Well, Salesforce DX is lifting up the hood and being able to see all the moving parts when you push the gas pedal of, oh, this is how it works, right? And so once I really kind of started wrapping my head around that concept, I was like, okay, this is figure outable. I just need to help translate between this dev speak and admin speak, because there was no bridge, right? And it's like, admins are smart. They are crafty. They are just grit. Like, admins are great. And there's no reason an admin can't understand this. It's just we need language as the bridge for them to get there. And that's what Salesforce DX for admins is.